the way we'll spend our time, giving you some feedback today on what we're hearing from some of the feedback on that state portion of this conversation. We'll go through a pretty detailed overview there. And then we'll spend the majority of our time working with you all with your teams, as well as giving us feedback on this state and local contribution component. And so we will have that, and you all will share about that feedback. And then, of course, if it remains at the end, questions and answers for the group. And so with that, I do think it's important to know who's kind of here and what teams you brought. So I'm asking our superintendents in the room to share, to tell us where you're from and what team members you have with you today. And Superintendent Dyer, may I start with you? Wonderful. And can we just go back to Dr. Cash? Can you all just tell us who you're with?
Designate, I'll start February 1st, so glad to be here. School board chairman Shelley Johnson, board member Nick Adams.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here. Yes.
Chair of County Schools, Mary Ellen Art, the Chief Finance Officer, lead with the Hampton County Government Finance, and Dr. Steve Highlander, County Board.
Wonderful. Thanks for being here.
I will say, mine is not big, so I may get these later.
Absolutely. I'm sorry about that. We have definitely had that across the state, carrying the load, but happy to have you here today.
Schools. Deputy Head of my finance office, Mayor John Jeffrey. Our chairman, our commissioners, David Cruz. This is Brent Howard. He is the vice chair of our school.
Fantastic. Thank you for coming today.
Mike Frazier, I have the finance director with me, and I also have our guest who's working.
Nice to see you all. And the rest of us, it's just the three of us here. And as other colleagues come in the room, we could absolutely give them the opportunity to introduce themselves. What I appreciate about all of this is that we do feel like these are the right people in the room and the right roles in the room to have this conversation. And I know Sam is going to walk through his part about some of the other work that's happening in the development of the formula. This really is about involving and engaging with folks who are actually most directly involved with this state and local contribution discussion. And so know how busy everyone is right now. Appreciate your time. But feel like this is really the right group of folks to talk about that local contribution. I will also say this is the first conversation we are having. Clearly, this is if this were something very simple, we could just say, well, wasn't that easy, and I'll go home. It is certainly not that. And so really, this is intended to be the first of several engagements and conversations. And as we get more information about the formula, we will be circling up again with information to work, to look at some models and to look at what it could look like if it were A versus B. So more to come, but important that you're here today so that we can begin the conversation. And what may come out of this today is the next time around, you may say, we really need so-and-so here. And so I'm certainly open to that. I cannot thank you enough for being here today. And I don't want to spend too much more time on that before we kick it off to Sam. But I will say this work of school planning at the state with state dollars, with local dollars, federal dollars, it really does work to kind of undergird all of the work that happens across the big buckets of work we do for the department. This is how it all gets done. This is where the magic happens, if you will. That is certainly the hard work and the necessary work to think about ensuring that our school funding formula meets the needs of our students today. We talked in a previous session. Certainly there are tweaks along the way, but there is obviously a reason why this hasn't been tackled in 30 years. And certainly I look back and think 10 years ago, think about where my kids were then and how much has changed. back to my own education 30 years ago and think, wow, clearly we've come a long way on what we needed then, what we need now is very, very different. And making sure that what we work on together here, what the subcommittees work on is about ensuring that we are developing something to meet the needs of where our kids are today. So again, couldn't do it without you, and I'm really appreciative to have you here. I'm going to hand off to Sam, who's going to walk us through some foundational information, but also just some information about what we're hearing across the state so far in this other part of the conversation around developing.
I'll introduce yourselves and give us a little bit of background, guys.
Absolutely. That's good.
I missed it.
No, I apologize. Maybe I did not. I'm Eve Carney. I'm the Chief of Districts and Schools at the department. I oversee all of the federal grants, federal programs of oversight, school turnaround, state special schools, the Achievement School District, and choice. So those are my big 5 buckets. I've been there a little over, well, getting close to 14 years in different capacities, but happy to be here with you today. Sure. It means virtual schools, it means charter schools, and non-public.
Answers.
We don't have vouchers.
Here's the Deputy Commissioner of Operations. I'm responsible for oversight for Finance Division, our IT Division, and our District Operations, as well as our Performance Management Division.
I'm Robin Hoff. I'm the Assistant Commissioner of School Turnaround. And I oversee all the supports to our priority schools, our TSI and HTSI schools across the state. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Cindy.
Thank you. Fantastic to have you here. Thank you for coming.
I'm bad. Richard City. At least it does.
That's not true. That's right. I was in your building not too long ago. That was, you do everything. I believe that. It's wonderful to have you here today. All right. So Sam, I'll get you to get us started.
Yeah, don't ever understate that. We all, especially in the state. So anyway, just try to acknowledge that. I also want to reemphasize and acknowledge our thanks to you all being here. For the directors, we know this is the end of the semester. It's a crunch time for you and your teams. We appreciate you being able to come in. And for school boards and other local officials, we know this is time out of your day, and we appreciate both your commitment to your local communities as well as this conversation. I truly want to admit that. We have one gentleman just come in. Do you want to introduce yourself before we? Sorry, would you like to introduce yourself before we jump in? Thank you. All right. See if I can manage not to trip over things. So what I'm going to cover for us today, I'm going to try to start by zooming out a little bit. I think the funding conversation has a lot of things happening in it. And for us to really meaningfully engage in this local contribution piece, we need to kind of understand what all is happening there. Because I understand people will have different levels of familiarity, both with what the conversation looks like now, what the BEP, the current funding formula, does and doesn't do, and how that impacts the conversation around what does state and local contribution look like? How do we divide that fiscal responsibility fairly? What do we do now? What do we want to do in the future? Those pieces. So I'm going to ask a little bit of grace in that I'm going to lead us through a little bit about what's happening in the conversation, and then I'm going to ask us to pivot to the local contribution piece. I want to be sure that I acknowledge on the front end, we still want your feedback on the overall funding formula side of this too, but the reason this group is convened specifically is because you all touch how the local contribution comes into play. And that's really important for this group and the skill sets and the experiences in the local context you bring to the table. So to start, I do want to talk about what this formula piece is, right? And just acknowledge we have the formula, that is, what all do we want to fund in public education? Somewhat agnostic to how are we going to fund that, right? It is building the pie, for the metaphor that lives on in me in school funding, right? Building the pie piece. And then we're going to circle back and really hone in today on this local versus state contribution. So two sides of that part. To start, This is what the conversation is about right now in kind of the broader context of the funding formula. It's about a pivot from a resource-based model to a student-based model. The commissioners mentioned this a number of times. If you include District of Columbia in there, you've got 39 states who already use either a completely student-based model or a hybrid student-based model. A lot of questions have surfaced about what does that mean? What is the big difference? And we've tried to hone in on a couple of examples that seem to resonate. Right now, the BEP, which is considered a resource-based model, generates some resource for students. You got 20 kindergartners, you generate one teacher. That teacher is the resource that is then funded. And that's how the BEP is structured. Special education, there's 10 different option codes based on the needs of a special ed student identified in their individualized education. Right? And those correlate to generating 8.5 students generate one teacher if you're an option code 10. 85 students generate one teacher if you're an option code 1. Right? Again, it's trying to fund the resource in that case, and in that instance, it's the teacher. Versus saying in a student-based model, what does speech therapy actually cost us to do? And how might we think about directly funding that need rather than kind of having this intervening variable in between? Right? Technology is another good example. There was $40 million dropped in the BEP pot to help support technology as a resource to districts. Sort of a different question than saying, what does a student need in terms of technology? I don't know a tech director in the state who hasn't flagged the issue of refreshing devices, right? Thanks for the one-time money. What do I do 3 years from now when those are all obsolete? How do we think about a student need around technology and funding that? That's kind of the difference in the framework between a resource-based model and the student-based model that's been discussed. Yes. Yeah, it's a very different, unique model, and that's why it's called out kind of separately, because they directly tie their taxes to their education funding level. So here we have property taxes generate connection points, and that is the local body generation. With the guaranteed tax base, it's kind of funneling more direct taxes. Like we have, what is a good example of this? Right? The LEAPS program. Right, this is the Lottery for Education After School program. LEAPS is considered a direct tax fund, so it's unclaimed lottery dollars fund after school programs. That's what they do, kind of on a bigger scale. Does that make sense? So overall feedback. This is kind of to give a little bit more meat on the bones of what a student-based formula would look like. There's a base amount that's allocated to each student in the state, regardless of unique characteristics, regardless of where they are in the state. Everyone gets this base funding amount. Weights, there are multipliers assigned to students based on it. We'll look at some examples, right? But think about your special education students in the case. Is there some other unique attribute about a student that warrants consideration for additional funding? Direct funding, these are specific program dollars. So think about your students who are taking AP classes or dual credit or the ACT retake. Those are things that can be tied very directly student to program need, direct funding. And then considerations about outcomes. So if we see a performance metric, whatever that might be, that a district is doing really well, how do we incentivize and reward that so that that continues to grow and reach more students? These are the pieces I really want to call out though. Across the subcommittee conversations, and there are 18 subcommittees going on right now representing different elements of the education landscape. There's student interests, different business, the whole 9 yards. These were the common things that came up. First, districts should not receive less state funding than they receive through the current BEP. Translation, we need more money, not trading out the dollars. We got like loud and clear that is resonated across the state very much as the top concern. 2, maintain flexibility for local district budgeting. I want to be really, really clear on this. You have heard the BEP reference potentially as a funding formula, not a spending plan. Nobody's talking about taking that away, right? The conversation here is actually to say, yeah, local decisions still make the most sense for how those dollars are spent. That's not being discussed as being removed from how this would work. Third piece, ensure that whatever is currently funded outside of BEP is included in the new formula. So as our directors of finance leads and federal programs will know, like there are a number of grants from the state, not federal dollars, state dollars that exist outside the BEP formula. Right? We have coordinated school health, we have school safety, and requirements for those programs exist all throughout the law, right? They may or may not be tied anywhere near the school funding section. Right? What has been discussed here is making sure that those actually become part of the formula and built into it. There's two things that I want to identify about this, because we've heard the feedback and I just want to go ahead and acknowledge it on the front end. That's not about a bait and switch. That's not about saying, hey, we're going to take the 20 million, we invest in school safety, put it in here and say we increase school funding. It's not about that. We want that transparency of things moving. Here's what it would do for districts. There's an immense amount of time that goes into filling out the plan, our state grant system application, requirements on reporting for each of those, all that are tied to just the fact that they exist outside the state funding. Holding them in, we eliminate that administrative burden. It doesn't change the fact that districts still have to do emergency operations. It doesn't change the fact that districts still have to do drill logs, and those will get audited by the Department of Safety. All of that still has to happen. But now the dollars are coming to the district, and the district is making the decision on what you need to fund rather than doing an entire separate grant application about it. The last piece, and very important for our conversation today, the local match components to be stable, what it would be under the BEP for 3 to 5 years. So as a little bit of a number cruncher myself, what I know to be true is that you cannot make an informed decision or even have an informed discussion about what changes to a local contribution could look like until you know the number and how it shapes out for you. I'm acknowledging that on the front. There is no way for us to do that in a meaningful, real sense. We are not asking you to today. Okay, we're going to talk through that in a minute. But what we want to know is how should we approach it? How should we tackle it? What information do you and your teams need in order to approach that conversation? We'll talk a little bit more about that in detail in a moment. Just to give you a sense, again, this is just trying to add a little more context to what the conversation has looked like. These are pieces of feedback for each of those tiers of the pyramid that we're hearing most frequently, both in public comment and in discussions from the Senate. Things in the base. So for those of you who follow conversations around Tennessee education funding, these will look familiar. They are the recommendations that have often bubbled up in our BEP review committee each year. It's about getting nurses into every school, or at least at the national recommended ratio, counselors, psychologists, same thing. Teacher salaries and benefits continue to remain a part of that big conversation. A single principal, at least at every school, right? We hear constantly about the pressures put on principals, and they're wearing a million hats, making sure that we actually fund one in every building. And this one, just as an operations guide, very close to my heart, flexibility for facility funding and we're deferred maintenance. So we have a lot of buildings that are aging very fast, and they take a lot of money to keep up with it. So being sure that that's acknowledged as part of what every kid needs from the state. I see a few people taking pictures of that. You just want to note, we will share this step, yeah, just so I say that. Yep, sorry about that. I'm mentioning it earlier. Weights. These are the, there's some usual suspects up here. Economically disadvantaged or concentration of poverty. Just pointing out, we've seen a little bit of conversation about both. Economically disadvantaged, those are direct certification students who may be receiving TANF or SNAP benefits as a family. The concentration of poverty is a new thing that has come. What are the compounding impacts in a high level of poverty all in an area? So thinking about the difference between Title I schools and non-Title I. Students with disabilities, English learners have been popular topics. Rural and sparsity. I will tell you, sparsity, this was one that bubbled up, and I thought, that is absolutely right. It's a fascinating thing that has not been captured previously. The difference in looking at a small rural district whose schools might be all within a 15-mile radius versus the county that is rural whose schools are 45 miles apart. That's a different transportation cost, right? Rural by itself doesn't capture that. Both of those districts may be rural, one may be sparse, one may not. And then other topics that continue to come up, fast growing and questions about charter enrollment, are also popular. Flags on things that we thought we would hear about that we have not heard as much. Gifted, dyslexia, small LEA size. We thought we would hear a little bit more about that, just kind of thinking about economies of scale. And K2 small class size. What I do want to pause in the middle of this slide and acknowledge is public comment is not over. This is just a snapshot of where things are. We want and encourage you and your stakeholder groups to be involved with that. Every piece of public comment is being reviewed and shared with the subcommittee. So all of that is going in, and I don't want anyone to think this is it. This is just what we have heard today. Some of the pieces in that additional potential direct funding that have been popular: financial literacy, middle school CTE. For those of you who worked with the federal Perkins grant, you'll know that it got extended down to middle school over the last couple of years. Thinking about what additional state investment might be beneficial for that moving forward as well. Innovative high school model. The grant program the state ran on its federal relief fund, and extremely popular. How do we keep that going and sustain that post the relief funds? Extended school year. This seemed to actually, in kind of word, follow more along the summer programming and the things that have been happening in that space. RTI, you all know this, the funding formula right now focuses on that more at a district level count, rather than thinking about it as programs being implemented in individual schools, and high dosage tutoring. And some of the outcomes that have been surfaced: early post-secondary opportunities, AP course completion, industry certs, work-based learning. You see the trend here. A lot of the focus in that conversation has seemed to be around post-secondary readiness and workforce readiness. What are we doing to actually achieve those as our long-term outcomes for kids? Again, this conversation isn't over. I just wanted to show you where we stand today so that you can kind of ground your thinking and your discussions today around this is what we're talking about on this funding formula side. So I'm going to pivot. This is my request for grace and that hard pivot that they always advise don't do in presentations, but we're going to do it anyway. I'm going to give a couple of slides of overview about the basic education program, this BEP, the existing funding formula, but really start to move us into this local contribution, and then really frame up how all of this is tied together for where we are today and what we hope to glean from you all. So for those of you who are less familiar with the BEP, it truly is basic level of funding for education. And it includes 47 different components, bucketed into 4 different categories. So we're already talking about a lot of things happening under the hood. Here's what I want to say about that out of the gate. No one is talking in a funding formula about simplifying down just for the goal of simplicity. We want transparency, but there's value in making sure that we're acknowledging all the things that are happening in schools as much as possible. That said, I'm presuming if anyone's tried to explain the BEP formula to a parent group, by the time we've said 47 components across 4 different categories, we're already a little bit in a rough spot. Moving to what that does for local contribution. Each of those 4 categories starts with a generic basic split, right? And this is a piece that I will flag. I know a lot of people use the sentence in the line, we've never really fully funded the BEP. I just want to call that out explicitly because we've heard it in a few different conversations today. The BEP has always been a shared cost model. It has always had a state contribution. It has always had a local contribution. It was changed over time, like different things happened to that, but it's always been a shared responsibility. And under law, we always fully fund the total that generates. So the concern that I believe most people are really trying to express in that is a question about, do I feel like that split is right? Do I feel like the state is covering that split? Or the question of, is it enough in total? Like those are actually what is really at play. The question of do we fully fund it or does the state cover its fair share? We would be in violation of the law if we did not. So I want to help people really grasp that concept and make sure that we're talking about, if there's an issue in the cost sharing model, let's talk about the cost sharing model. That's what this conversation really is about today. So across each of those 4 categories, it starts with a basic split. So our instructional component, for example, starts with a 70-30 split, 70% state funded, 30% local funded. That ranges on down to 50-50 for non-classroom components. Each of those starting point split has been further adjusted for fiscal capacity. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But in general, that's trying to capture the ability of a county to contribute to its local education. So if a county has a high property tax value, they may be able to, and I'm using my words carefully here, be able to fund their school system at a higher rate than someone who has a lower, right? What ends up happening as a result is that where we start in the instructional component of a 70-30 split, that gets adjusted slightly. Counties that have a higher ability to pay pick up a little bit more, the state picks up a little bit less. Counties that have less ability to pay, the state picks up a little bit more, the county picks up. That's what we're talking about when we say the state and local contribution piece. The place that most local officials live in, you all know the revenue sources that you have available to you to meet those. First majority of that across the state is property tax, but there will be other options, sales tax, wills tax. Again, that will differ for each of you. I want to spend a moment on fiscal capacity because, yeah, of course.
It's not happening on that, all those buckets have to be filled. It's the fact that, I mean, I'll just take lead testing, for instance.
Yeah.
Everybody has to have everything tested, water's tested, everything. That was a Band-Aid. There was no change in the BEP formula to include that.
Right.
So I think it's unfair.
That's actually a very important distinction to be
Yes.
able to start this, right? Because if you go and say to legislators, it's not fully funded, and they come and ask us, we don't have a choice but to say, like, here are the dollars for each of the components that are written into law. Like, here's one at number 36, right? You know, first is being able to say, here are all the things in law that cost us money that aren't funded. You got it. Right. We talked about that one. That just. Yeah. And that's what I want to encourage you guys to bring up. Like, those are the types of things that you should have those discussions to push into the base, right? If ensuring kids have clean water to drink at school should be a basic expectation, we should make sure that's covered in the base. Those are the types of feedback that are helpful for the subcommittees as they look through them. And I think in the public discourse on it, separating that from fully funding all the needs that we have to run schools effectively for students versus saying the line, it's not fully funded, right? Just that distinction. Okay, fiscal capacity. This is that variable that changes everything for you all, right? The first one that hits is that basic split. Is it 70-30? Is it 50-50? What is it? And then this one comes along. Again, there's a lot of financial modeling underneath these, but at a top line level, it's an attempt to capture the ability of the county to raise local taxes for education. The second bullet is important for understanding. It's not based on what is actually raised. It is not based on what is actually raised.
So in other words, if we give a tax incentive to bring a corporation in and they are off the tax base for 10 years, we're still expected locally to cover that amount of money.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like say a company comes in and it actually helps increase the property value of taxes, since that's a bigger one.
I mean, the taxes the company pays.
Well, so the reason I'm not speaking to that is because does that make sense? Whereas property tax, I know everyone in this room is having to drive a good chunk, the majority of your property taxes.
It's very important.
So if a company comes in and that raises the property tax value of your county, right?
Also the amount,
That's
if
what
you have a huge corporation, they pay immense taxes.
Yes.
And when they are relieved of that for 10 years, that cuts down the tax base.
Yeah.
But still, that cuts down the state amount of money that comes into the school system.
Yes. Yes, and that is the general notion of how fiscal capacity works, right? And again, rooting that in property tax, if all the property tax values go up in a county, like fiscal capacity would reflect that. It doesn't reflect whether or not the county actually decided to raise property tax values for it. And again, I'm glad to hear this feedback. This is the discussion that's coming. So you guys are already spot on to where we need to go.
They still pay the education tax. We don't live, we don't not. We still get the education tax period with any company comes to Brevard County.
Right, and same way it happened. Okay, same way it happened. But still, that's only maybe 10% of the total tax. They get forgiven a lot of that. But actually,
And that'll differ, yeah. Well, it's inherently gonna vary, right? So let me keep working through this, but you guys are starting to delve into where we're gonna go with discussion. So I'm gonna ask that you guys hold and bring that part up once we get to that. The formula determines fiscal capacity on average rates across the state. So it really is about a relative measure, right? It's determined at the county level, not at individual district level. So for those of you who have special school districts or city school districts, those don't get their own fiscal capacity though. It's tied to the county. And then the current BEP model relies on two different fiscal capacity calculations, one from UT, the Sieber team, and TASER. Those are combined. Again, right now that's a notion that was an addition to the BEP a few years back, right? To get two different expert reads on fiscal capacity. All going to be open for discussion momentarily. Here's where that leads you as local officials. You get two different numbers from all of this process that you are expected to consider when it comes to how you fund local education. The first is the required local match. That is what all that formula generates. At the end of the day, after all the general splits are applied and the fiscal capacity is applied, there is a number that is, this is what the state is putting in, this is what the local community is required. That's your local required. Separately, and in a totally different part of state law, there's a maintenance of effort requirement. In general, that says you as a local community must put in the same, if not more, funding to your education system this year as you did last year. With a slight exception for decreasing enrollment, you can file for an exemption from that. These are the two numbers that matter to how the process works right now. What the formula says you must put in, and then this maintenance of effort. Here's what we know. Counties are putting in a lot more across the board than what the formula generates. That's got to be part of the conversation, right? How do we think about that? How do we look at that differently? That's in this maintenance of effort. There are some counties that are right at their required local match. Right? And that may be the politics and the context and the ability of the area, right? The political willingness, the capacity of the people to afford it. Could be lots of reasons. Distress County, like there's all sorts of things that may have someone at that level. That all has to be part of this conversation. So where does that all leave us? And this is where we're kind of trying to pull all of this together. I said at the beginning of this that as a number cruncher myself, like there is no way we could have an informed, good, robust conversation about local contribution until people see the number. There's just no way. You can't commit yourselves to a formula that you don't know what the dollar figure at the end of it's going to be. I get that. But this is where we are starting a recommendation proposal. And what we're going to ask for tweaks, direction, what would you need to make this work? Do you like this? Do you not? This is what it is. It's not about figuring out a new local match formula. We're not trying to do that. We're not getting to that decision. But what we are starting as the process is to say, let's separate these two conversations. All that we discussed there at the beginning about a student-based formula, how do we create that moment now? There's urgency about getting money into our schools for our kids. There's urgency about leveraging this opportunity and time, this appetite at the state level to have this conversation, both in the General Assembly, from the governor's office. But until we know what shakes out from that, we can't really have a strong conversation about local contributions and what that should look like. So what we're proposing is from whatever moment, when and if a new formula is decided on and passed by the General Assembly. Let's take 12 months to settle out what that could look like.
This is part of the issue that we have. They need to have transparency. They don't say just hearing you correctly. I will have one flip slide, maybe two. Charter schools. I understand the concept of charter schools. They all public.
Yes.
Private.
All charter schools are public schools. Yeah, and so let me make sure that I acknowledge just one slight wording difference. The state always funds its share as the current BEP is structured. I think Director Cash's comment about what are the other conversations that aren't funded is a broader one. Does that make sense? I said that's fair. Yep. Fully funding the BEP, but I think that's why we're having this conversation too. Again, I want to acknowledge, like, I'm not trying to play semantics. I actually want to help make sure that the way we talk about this moves the needle on what we really want to move forward.
Debt is our county carriers who pays the debt payment each month, year, whatever they do it. All the debt we have is about schools. State funds no school buildings for us. So I think that has to be part of the numbers that we use. Those numbers, they get benefit, the county commissioners get benefit of building schools and having to pay for it without having to be penalized and be paid.
So debt services came up this morning as well. Again, I'm going to ask you guys just to hold off just one more minute. You're already hitting on all the right topics. I don't want to dampen that too far, but want to make sure that we move through this piece. And this is what we need your reactions to. If this is what we do, if we say, you know, it when should, and again, all of the caveats painted out there that the General Assembly will do as they desire and wish in reflection of their constituents. If we come to session this year and there is a bill that introduces a new funding formula, we would propose right now that what gets written into that is, let's hold tight on local contributions. Let's have a year-long conversation and say, by the end of that year, whatever process, and again, this is where we need your feedback, we decide to really delve into the concepts of local contribution and what's fair and what isn't, and how does that capture all the things that are outside and all of those nuances. And then say, even after we make that decision, we know there needs to be a ramp up, right? There's a change that happens, even if it's just budget and not a net dollar change. There's change that has to happen that needs time to be accounted. So the starting point for discussion, proposal, and again, this is truly, you know, we've got caught in this catch-22 of like balancing wanting input to develop something versus, and then people saying like, well, I want to see what it is before I react to it, versus creating something and saying, why didn't you give me a chance to provide input on the front? Is our attempt to thread the needle. This is where we are based on the feedback we've heard from the subcommittees, and this is where we need you all to help drive the input further. So here's what that would translate to. It's in real state. Local districts could see more state funding, more state dollars in a new formula, but local communities would not have to contribute anything additional for at least 5 years. That is our starting point. Again, open to reactions, open to the pushes when we get to the discussion. And then to do that, we propose a year to develop a new formula for the local share, right? To say, how do we look at this different? I have no projections of what that could turn out to be. Could be the exact same, something similar to what we have under the BEP. It could adjust fiscal capacity. It could start to include debt services that it hasn't previously. It could, you know, factor in what does the economy look like projected out 5 years. Could switch to real base. No projections about what all could be on the table for that conversation. We're asking now, how do we structure that conversation? If that's an idea that you're open to. And I think I will pause there because Eve is going to come back up and kind of facilitate discussions with your groups. What I want to encourage is that you all have already started to surface the exact things we need you to be able to delve into for us. Help us understand two major things here, right? The first is going to be, what information do you need, right? I live and breathe in the BEP funding formula along with like godsend of Marianne Dursky, like all the time, right? And even at my level, I still have to go back and do references to understand TASER and CBER. Like, do you need information sessions on that? Do you need to see what other people are doing for that kind of fiscal capacity calculation? What information would be useful to think about those starting point divides, right? We had a great point surfaced in the session earlier. And if you take some of these grants and fold them into the funding formula, we got to be aware of whether or not those grants already required a local match or not. That's a great point. You're spot on. We have some grants from the state that require a local match outside the BEP. We have some that do not. We got to be aware of that. That drives that conversation differently, right? We need to know what information you need. I'm going to steal some of Eve's thunder. We know the first item on the list for everyone is the dollar figure and the new formula. We don't have that answer for you today. So I just want to acknowledge that and say it. We know that piece has to be there to drive it. I think the questions will be, what else do you need? And then as we get that, what are these considerations? Like debt services, like what are the things you would want elevated in that conversation? And again, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So I'm going to turn it over to Eve to start facilitation and really dig into this.
I think the one thing I would just say, and then listen to that, and then listening to your questions and responses and feedback is the reason why this warrants a more in-depth discussion, conversation, nuances, knowing that this looks very different across the communities across our state. And so, as Sam noted, we're going to spend a little time. We're going to ask a couple of things. I'm going to ask that you work with your team brought today, but for some of you who may be represented, standing alone representing circle up at a nearby district or friends in the room, to have a couple of things. Have a discussion on the following, and then we will report that out to the group. I do believe there is value in hearing comments from other teams because it just makes gotten to it yet. Here's something that will trigger additional questions. And as Sam said, part of this is really trying to surface those things now versus after the fact of saying, well, we should have thought about X or Y. And this is our opportunity to begin that conversation. And I say begin because, as he noted, we can't build models. We can't run straw man without the number. And we know that. And so what we hope to do is, as the subcommittees continue their work over the rest of this month into January, and we actually get a little closer to that, we want to be able to come back to you prepared with what you have now shared with us that is also needed beyond that amount, so that we can structure our supports and our conversations around those things. And so here's what we're asking. This is within your team, and however I would certainly encourage you to brought your team to work together, but welcoming others if they are listening and if need be. What information that you would need to be able to talk to your stakeholders, because we understand that this involves certainly schools and school boards and commissions and mayor's offices and all the other commissions and all the pieces there. And so what would it take? And so we tried to bucket it into three big things. What are the three things, if you had to name them, what would be the three other pieces or things you would need to know as a local leader to be able to have that conversation with your stakeholders? That's the first thing. The second thing I would say are the data points. And we had some really good feedback from the morning session about this, about do you work with data? Do you need comparison data? Do you want to see models that are being used elsewhere, whether that's in other states or here? We had some comments about we would like to see like a comparison of what BEP would have been and what this new model would have been. So thinking about what other data points would be helpful for us to bring back to you, so we're not wasting time. We can bring you what you need, and we can have more of a work session, I would say, rather than us talking in the abstract, because we are missing obviously a key component. The last thing is, what other information would be helpful? What we know, and Sam alluded to, is there are very few people who can really talk specifically about TASER and CBER. Are there other ones? Should we pursue other ones? Do we know enough about those two models to be able to even make an informed decision of, does that 50-50 split of those two models still make sense? Or are there things that are not working in that current structure? And so that's really what we're trying to get to, is asking you to really drill down and think critically about what it is that you know now and what you would need from us, whether that's information, trainings, data, whatever, that would be able to help us further this conversation. If they finish the proposal in late January and it gets given to the steering committee who pushes it to the General Assembly, we want to be ready to be able to, in that legislation, if we get to that point, to be able to say, here's the feedback we've had on this group, and we stand ready to spend the next 12 months thoughtfully to do this well so that it works for all districts, and try to really kind of tease apart the things that are concerning or problematic in our current model. It's no secret, there have been all kinds of challenges to the BEP, and so trying to learn from that and make sure that we are moving forward in a better direction. So what I'd like for you to do is to circle up. We'll probably give, every time I do this, I get it wrong, like 15 to 20 minutes for the discussion, coming back to share out with the group those things. I will say this morning was very informative and really gave us a lot of good information. So I'm looking forward, knowing that you all are already clearly thinking about this, very interested in getting your feedback and adding that to this discussion today. So any questions on the ask before we just kind of, and you can circle up and move your chairs and do whatever you need. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
This may not be pertinent now, but are we looking at all with the student funding following the child, dealing with monies going to private institutions or homeschooling? Is that even a consideration?
No. This is about, I'm glad actually that you flagged that, because I do think, and one of the things that has always been true, the money in the BEP has always followed the student. So if I move from Hamilton County to Dyer County, then I'm absolutely, that BEP, that ADM, that goes to the other district. It is absolutely not about following a student out of public education into a private. It is not about that. This is absolutely about making sure that whomever is providing services to that student, and I know that you have counties and city systems, and sometimes kids kind of move between those, or there's open enrollment in certain places, making sure that the money that is generated to serve Robin is staying with
Just
Robin.
to public education.
That is correct.
which is what the state constitution.
That is exactly right. 100%. You're welcome. All right. Any other clarifying questions before we circle up? So we'll start with about 20 minutes, but again, the other thing I would flag as like a preview for the second question, and Sam alluded to it also, are there other, as if this comes up in your conversation flagging, are there other considerations that need to be elevated? And I will leave it at that for now, but as you are having those discussions, I know we were in one place and the comment was made that, well, yes, we have a wheel tax, but it's already maxed out. Are there other little things that should be elevated, other considerations in those conversations? All right, I will let you all get started and we will try to circulate the room and get back together here in a bit. I know. Okay. Stay where you are, you don't have to move. I just want to kind of go in and begin the process. We're going to be taking notes as well. But really look forward to hearing because of the conversation, lots of great conversation in the group I've been in. And Sam off over there, and he's still talking. So we'll get to them in just a moment. But what I would like to do is just start here, just kind of go work our way across the room and hear those comments. Excuse me, y'all, too much talking this week. And we're going to start right here. Superintendent Frazier.
We asked a question about, we asked a question about insurance, about being fully funded and being talking about single versus family or teachers. Those, we have some teachers that choose family, and we would like to see more money and put into insurance to cover the cost, because we're having to cover a whole lot of the cost. And so it costs us several $1,000s. But anyway, that's one.
So that would probably be in that base that we're.
Yes, yes.
An increase in the salary benefits part of the base, and then you as a district make the determination.
Yes. And then the other thing that we would like to see the state do or ask is fully funded pre-K.
Pre-K, yes.
Yes.
That is actually something that has been surfaced about whether that pre-K piece is part of the base, or how would that be? So I think that's.
Well, I think if you really, to me, fairness, rather than just being based on the family's economic situation, all children, no matter what kind of family they come from, they all deserve that experience. And if they're not getting it, which a lot are not, because we have to take a list every year to either allow them to come in or not. And so it would be good if the state would help us where we can fully fund it and bring everybody that wants to come in.
Perfect. Thank you for that feedback, and I think that's definitely something we've heard, is what does the role of pre-K, knowing also that kind of there's this federal legislation that included universal pre-K
Yes.
for a period of 5 years. But then the states can be responsible. So we could, I think that's one of the things that are being, eventually going to make its way down to us. Appreciate that feedback and that point.
I'll start us off. Like now, how does the increase in our sales tax, we had an increase in sales tax a year ago, how does that affect our ability to pay?
So I do think that, and Sam, I might ask you to chime in, increases of sales taxes would be part of that determination on your ability to pay. Isn't that sales tax part of that? And that is actually something that as we work through and we take this extended period of time to work through, absolutely something that we need to consider, and which model and is that something, is that model something you would want to continue? Anything else there?
We have 2 city schools. That's 3 different schools. That factor to the point.
Yes, we have, with so many special school districts and municipalities across the state, that is absolutely something we're hearing. And the impact, and that's what I would capture from this, is what is the impact when you are a county with special city districts or special school system districts, and that impact. So thank you for that flag. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Amazon is now, and businesses like that is now charging sales tax on most of the purchases. How is that distributed back into the county system? Come into the county, and then Macon County, we share with the other systems. Like I live in the county, not the city, so when you're out buying Amazon, it's going into the county to be shared with other systems.
I'll make a note of that. I will defer my answer on that because I can't say that I'm 100% certain whether that, based on your own structure, where that would go, but I have taken that down. And I'll get you a response.
Yes, I think about that a little bit. My local government is paying for 24% professional staff this time because I know we're fully funded with BED, but the ratios can be, at least for Meigs County, not accurate. We get paid for one RTI person when we have 6. That's just one example, but it's like that through a lot of areas. We get paid for one nurse, but we got 5, especially in COVID. 5 for 4 schools. So that for us is a big burden for our local folks to pick up because that's 1/4 of our professional staff. The other thing is just with the task receiver, if that's going to continue to be a part, then yes, we need training. If it's not, don't give us.
That's fair. That's fair. And I think,
That's right, the particular.
and I do think that's going to be like a very important like decision point. Do we go with what we know and seek to understand it and then adjust percentages based on that? Or do we try to see if there are other models out there? Do your professional staff the amounts? One of the things we were having in a different conversation is if this new formula that's being built somehow in that base includes nurses, then all of a sudden you're freeing up additional dollars that you have been paying for nurses to do something else with. I know the other one we're hearing a lot that comes out of local are like ed assistants or pros being something that is oftentimes pretty readily funded with your local funds.
One thing I didn't see up there is assistant principals. We have 0 funding for assistant principals in our state funds.
I would say if I had to name the one piece of feedback that has been most consistent is in assistant principals and the need for buildings that have them. I think the other positions, but that one has been called out readily, and I appreciate flagging here also, especially when you're talking about the way in which teacher evaluation, how that gets done along with all of the other.
Sure, and with the push for test scores, T-bonds, evaluations, instructional coaches would be one. We have a hard time keeping up with folks around us that have instructional coaches. And I have no doubt that we lose staff to these folks sometimes because we don't have those coach positions at all.
That's a great flag. Thank you. Once again,
I think it's a lot of our it's what's in the formula? Because again, students are using space and buildings to space that we fund our capital on the waiting. So they need space for space for that. So how we help that funding appreciation that we can take care of the space, provide the space, build and be able to replace the space. And it's the second part of the but then it also kind of comes into the fiscal capacity. The county's already pretty much towards building that or there's less fiscal capacity out there. Considers that it looks like what you could have out there. And then on the world, understanding it. Here's going to kind of lie because not the whole county, but there's sort of a part of that's good.
Feel like the money following the students, our students are very diversified. We've got part 4 intercity, we've got suburban, we've got spread out rural, all within one county. So you can't designate a whole county with rural, urban, or what, you need to be sure that.
that's a goal now because we certainly have districts that, you know, are fully rural, but we also have, as you just said, situations where have concentrations within the city, but then you clearly have parts of that.
So that higher match, and if something changes to that. Please. So it's less, but then the makeup that will let that. APM may not change, it can just be types of students, types of students might change. So just make us better, might need to be considered what formula or natural.
So just to say it back to make sure, like, we know that as we have a formula, and if we're saying that we're structuring it around what students need, especially when we think about the weights, as those weights change year to year and fluctuate up, the next year you're gonna get stuck because your maintenance of effort is here, even though maybe your student demographic changes and though you didn't generate weights anymore, you're still up, is that about right? That's great feedback. Thank you all. What's that our group back there?
So just to echo what a lot of you all have said, I agree with mine. Preschool, we're certainly in favor of. What does that look like? Where do I put those kids? And will teachers qualify for the favors being hired for that? You know, do we have enough roles? A lot, you know, to echo what Glenn said too, we want just give us the model and let us plan our numbers. That's what we're waiting. Sure. In regards to transportation, we're going to need to get here out of it, which show is our working companies. So transportation is important to us. We want to be very aware of our relationship between our school board. It's a really great working relationship.
But it's what you would conflict with that.
Want it to be our. One concern that I have that may be unintended consequences with these weights, particularly special, and I don't want them to create overriding. No, I don't think anybody would deliberately do that, but I think it's probably wrong.
I think that's a fair flag and certainly something, because I do feel like what we know is there is no one size fits all for any student, but certainly when we know that students with special needs have different, some of it may be speech, maybe someone blind, and there's a whole lot of real estate, but making sure that we structure it away, make sure we're allotting funding to serve that student, but also not, if that's a fair.
For whole child. You talk to anybody in any school building right now, look at it. Say yes. Need school nurses, need clinical, need behaviors.
I had real fast what she said.
Sure.
On the special ed waiting. Other states surrounding us wait gifted aids. And I think we are missing a lot when we don't take care of our gifted as we should.
And that was one of the things that I appreciate you flagging that we expected to hear more of, because we certainly as a state recognize that as a disability category. It's not in the federal list, but it is at one of our state ones. And so I think calling that out, especially, and thinking that any adjustments there from the state funding would likely consider that. I appreciate you flagging. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask one
Of course.
question. She mentioned the issue we're all facing. With our ages, there is behavioral issues. These kids coming in are just, they have issues we haven't seen. And it's just getting worse and worse every year. And they need somebody with them all day long. And that funding is not there right now. So I would hope that, as she said, that would be considered moving forward.
And I do believe that is also very consistent, you know, in everywhere in the conversations I've been in across the state, it is very concerning about, you know, kids coming back from the post-pandemic and just the need for the behavior. But I think that, you know, when we lived through a pandemic and you remember and you hear the statistic that just hurts your heart that says the number of child abuse cases went dramatically down during the pandemic because teachers are mandatory reporters and think about what's happening with kids not in their buildings and they're not getting fed. And it's certainly a complex issue, but one that gets to the heart of, you know, we all love kids and we would do what we do. So making sure we take those. I appreciate you flagging and flagging about. Quick question, Dr. Cash.
Pre-K, pre-K, the problem I have with that is I think we were to take over pre-K. The federal government's in a pre-K program, and I don't think they know what they're doing. And I think it'd be much better served if we did that locally. And we could make those changes like you were just talking about. As long as federal government's involved in it, I think, give you an example. They sent out a letter to some of our students, said they're 2-year-olds going to have to wear a mask. Okay, now that's the most asinine thing anybody can ever say. So that's the problem with the federal government. So they're telling our pre-K people, this is what you have to do. I think it's time that our school systems take over pre-K and really make a difference in the pre-K what we do today. I'm not sure if we get our money's worth. That's just not good.
Thank you.
And also, for Bradley County, we're talking about nurses. We have nurses in every one of our schools. We have instructional coaches. We have tech coaches. We have lots of things. We shouldn't be penalized for spending the money in those categories in the BEP. Somehow, I think at some point we need to look back and say, okay, Bradley County's done this the last 5 years. They didn't just change it because the BEP has changed or done something else. And we're penitent. We don't get any money for those positions because we've already been funding them. Does that make
So let
sense?
me ask you this question. So let's pretend for a moment that in a new formula, that base includes a nurse in every school. So then Bradley County no longer has to spend that out of local dollars. And you could say, good news, we can do capital outlay, we can do infrastructure, we can do other things with that money. I do think, but I agree, I don't think anyone would want to penalize a district for the hard work and decisions you all have made to.
Years ago.
And I think that really what we hope is that as we think about what should be true for all kids, that we then are also allowing you all to take some other priorities and fund those differently rather than saying, oh, you already do that, we're not giving you that. That's certainly not.
I'm afraid to fall back into the ability to pay. We how's it all going to look? Will it hurt us on what we're doing? We want to pick when everybody benefits. Okay? We should, because we just choose to put our money in different places, in a different pot to make somebody else.
But what he's talking about happened to some of us with SRO. So I mean, that happened because we just funded the youth forward. And yeah.
Bradley County funds all this programs. The county commission, we got a grant 8 years ago, I don't know, it was 20 years. Got a grant 2 years, 3 years, and then the Bradley commission picked up the cost. Now, Bradley County School budget, on the county's budget, so, or they added it to the sheriff's budget, how's that? But we have an SRO in our schools have had it for years.
No, great point. You're exactly right about this. I'm like that because that is. But I do think very, very fair flag and making sure that it's incentivizing decisions.
This just hit me. Over here, I was Kim, but he was speaking about we were going away from our resource funded formula. So does that mean when we're trying to meet BP requirements, does that mean that requirement will also go into that or it will stay in place? Because one of the things that occurs to me is, and I was talking to Sam a little bit about having to consider not only different size districts, but also your fiscal ability to pay, because you might have a medium-sized district that's very affluent, but you might have another one that's very heavy in poverty. And it seems like the BP in some ways helps some districts in some areas and hurts others. So I worry that, the new plan will be the same. For instance, and this is just a very basic example. When the BP formula is deciding how many teachers it will fund for like K through 2, we have many more teachers than it funds. Of course, it is basic. We understand that. But if we were trying to more fully fund education, one thing that I have noticed is that because we have, the BP will be fairly accurate if all your kids were in one big building. So one thing I just was playing around with, I was like, look, added 1% for every location. Like we have 11 elementary schools. So if you tweaked that formula to add 1% for every location, it almost exactly is the number of teachers we employ. And that's just because you may have one school that you have to have a third, second grade teacher, but just barely to meet the BP requirement. And then you do that across the district, you're talking about funding 8 additional teachers.
It might be 3 here.
Right. And so I think something like that could work statewide, because even in your big metro areas, you're still gonna have, you're gonna add, you're gonna layer for those people that have all these different locations. That's just one thing that I noticed really would help. And then I noticed in BP, it doesn't fully fund your secondary or duty free, period. So when I adjusted all of that, I got within 6 positions of what we actually do. So I would love to see something be in place that would help all school systems. If that makes sense.
It makes sense, absolutely. And to your point of like this, there are requirements, there are things in the law that you still have to abide by the law. The one thing that I think, and provide whatever services are required, but what they're trying to move away from is say, rather than saying, okay, you earned one principal for every 500 students versus, or an assistant principal for every 500 students, I think is for my kids, I remember the principal going, good news, we're at 498. If I find 2 more kids, I get an assistant principal. Like moving away from something that feels like that, to say every building needs a leader, and every, whether that's a principal and an AP or what that could look like. I think that's still have to meet the class size requirements, but one that we probably put a little more money and decision making back on.
I'd like to piggyback off that just a second,
Sure.
what you said. Correct me if I'm wrong, and I can tell you some of the others. K-2 has an average, composite average of 20 students, is that correct?
That's correct.
But yet you may have kindergarten that has tremendous needs in reading, that has, that they, you cut down the average to 20, but then you need to have, you have large kindergartens, it's really difficult to do that. So it needs to be, instead of an average K-2, it needs to be 20 for kindergarten, 20 for first grade, 20 for second. That would be more state funding, I realize, but would that not help? I think, and then also for, for this, with the third and fifth is what, 25. So the same thing there. I think that would be really beneficial to schools, and when they're spread out, you don't want a kid, some of our kids are looking at busing to have to ride an hour and 5 minutes each way when they're 5 years old. And we want to keep them in community schools.
Right.
But it'd be much easier if we went on grade average rather than K-2 average, 3 to 5. And you guys are dealing with it closely.
Also, they talk about poverty. You can have 20 kids that's in poverty, and it's like 40 kids.
That's right.
Because, you know, you'll say, well, you have Title I, but Title I does not fill those gaps at all. Title I is just a touch. And I think we have to address that. In Bradley County, we probably have 3 or 4 schools that are in poverty, and 20 kids in a class, if they have learning disabilities and all the other things, it's difficult for a teacher to do that. And we really don't knock the home run that we really should be doing. The only way we can do that is lower that number in those, and lots of people will benefit from that, not just Bradley County, but it's a huge ordeal to have 20 students that most of them are in poverty. That's exactly right. We need something in there.
And if you have that way, for your economically disadvantaged, then you locally could determine
That's
it's
exactly right.
actually here that we need smaller classes. So we're going
That's
to invest
exactly
those
right.
dollars towards your kids in that way, in that exact school. I think that's part of the thing I keep coming back to is we don't stand and expect to say, oh, we know what's best for Bradley County. That is certainly for you all to decide, but to give you the money and then the flexibility to make those that are decisions that are specific to your context and needs.
But I like the idea you give the money and say that's what it's for. We don't use it there, but I like to get a line out and say, we're addressing this issue. This is to address this issue, just like this is to address insurance. Okay?
I agree.
How we do that is obviously should be our choice. Thank you.
Oh, you're good.
Right, one more thing. I mentioned all that. Like really for missing, except we my technology personnel and the second, and remember, I have so much pain. So that get us to that one addition. But that's down, I think I'll need John, getting all ready and bring all the technology side. I'm trying to help teachers. So that's the only thing I thought in the slide about the supervision. I think we should rank 5 positions. So I would like to see that be in the place. I think because it's not going to get any easier. It's only technology is only going to get.
What is unique overall in all this 23 months?
Last thing anyway, replacing it.
Right. And that, when we think about what needs to occur in the different tools in how they do their or their roles. It's been a beta test with districts of different sizes and different ways to find it. And we probably county did that was to say right County one pilots the formula. Then we're constantly getting feedback on what they want to do. And then after this, the buildings recently school just into there's a lot of opportunity space for county and there are questions that can, if we're layering into the formula, all those layers that increase what we stay. Just a question with the formula weightage now of the model does need to change. Like the way you over lunch and we that there's total, so it doesn't get down because you're not losing it. So great feedback as well, and I think some really important things that we can take back. And there's not just for the development, but even as we think about related to, I think that's a great idea. Thinking about their district configurations and something that's part of that. That's really helpful. And I think looking at some of the profiles of the system, I think that's also a really strong suggestion. I appreciate the feedback there. I think that's a yeah, I think that is really because I do think people and probably the thing we hear often acknowledge that in some cases it has been true in the past, the unfunded mandate piece, but making sure that you address like the going forward that we're talking about today or tomorrow, maybe 5 years from now. Let's be honest, this one's been in place for 30 years. We could talk about 15 years from now. Hopefully not, because I think we have to learn that our needs change, our students change, and we need to make sure that as a state we are acknowledging that and yeah, we heard about that. This is going to be into what I thought that that was part of it, and nothing else. So it's because of the medicine.
Well, they say the physical. Anybody who comes on the stand, they says this way it costs, they can choose the funds or not. It shows a lot of situations. It's not to be funny.
Correct.
Well, I would think it would have to be a law instead of a DEP form for them to adhere to that. To that rule. It would have to be a law. It could be.
And I do think there's value in having those pieces in the formula itself, because I do think it can be a little easier sometimes to pass things outside the BEP, as we like to say. But when you think about having your school funding all within the formula, it is less likely that you're going to have these one-off things versus like addressing what is in there as part of the actual funding. So I think those are all really good suggestions and comments, especially thinking about that, like building in some language that would almost trigger something to be funded immediately. That delay piece was also in the back to say let's say you're funding weights on a student that is a short English learner, for example, and then you begin serving that student, but then the funding is a little bit delayed. I think that's also a really important point to surface to say if we're really trying to make sure that kids have what they need when they need it, something that needs to be considered. Another good flag. I do know that our general counsel's been working hard to, think about all of the pieces, what other things are in the law that the BEP somehow touches or informs the BEP. And so that's certainly one that we've been talking about. I know we're getting close on time, but were there any other considerations that anyone surfaced that should be considered? I threw a couple of them up here that we've heard in other sessions about, do you build in something for inflation or cost of living, almost as automatic considerations. And then thinking about the future, and I threw up Haywood County there as the easy example to know that, 6 months ago, a year ago, their world has changed in every district around it. So thinking about future projections in this conversation about how we also would make adjustments. Any other considerations you all feel like should be elevated?
Yeah. Actually, so some way that helps, I guess, trends on that, so that you're, especially, I would think, especially if it doesn't have as much as for county.
Right.
It gives it for them, they hire, they get right out.
Yeah, I think that's a great flag and something that we have to make sure that there's confidence that there is a level of stability to continue and maintain operations that's not, hinging on one student moving or whatever. That's kind of a simple example, but making sure that there is a level of stability. I think that's a great call.
Legislators, right about 3 years.
But we're gonna add this back because I do think that this is the time. This is the time to have these conversations and to surface the things that need to be true. We've been talking a little bit around this, and I'll put it up there just so you all know that we were thinking about. So as you all fill out the survey and give other feedback, if you have feedback about what the structure, and what I mean by that is, if we take 12 months to do this and do it well, what does the structure of that get? Is it monthly? Is it learning sessions? Is it more of a work session? Who should be who should be represented, knowing that there are fluctuations in positions and things like that? But who do we involve? How do we do that? And then how do we, of course, the structure itself, and then knowing that how do we hold ourselves accountable for the outcome of that in the model that we would then put forward, trying to make sure that we're thinking about those things. So as you are driving back today and you're thinking about, well, what would that look like? What would be the cadence? What would be the type of sessions that would be needed to do the work that we all are talking about today? Thinking about all the feedback that you've heard today and what a structure to actually develop that could look like. And so as you go back, and as I said earlier, you may think of other folks that you need to talk to that should have, I wish they could have heard this. I wish they could have been here. As Sam pointed out, we will make a deck available. And of course, we'll continue to be available as well through this discussion and back with you probably in, I'm going to say mid to late January, as soon as we get the hard numbers that we would need to make this next round more of a discussion of the actual models. And I would just say continuing to collect feedback and input. The last thing I'll put up here is, you know, we are all taking notes and we all pile those and share those, but strong points, I mean, also hearing from you directly through that, that is where all of the feedback is going through directly to through the commissioner's office, but also up to all of the subcommittees. So I would say if you have strong feedback that we will capture from this group, I strongly encourage you also to submit that directly as well, because I think that is really powerful, knowing that you have examples that are specific to your context that I can't capture. And so I would encourage you to do that. That is our time today. Does anyone have anything else before we our